Spooky subscriber accounts. Thank you to Jane, that's not her real name, for sending in these intriguing accounts and amazing photographs via email to alisoncrocker1@gmail.com. Jane writes, I have been watching your YouTube videos with interest over the past few months. I find the stories told by the various different people fascinating. I was wondering if you'd be interested in my story. A few things have happened to me over the years which have made me wonder if there was more out there than this earthly life that we live. One experience in particular stays with me, but there are a couple more I would love to tell you about, one involving the whole family witnessing an event. This particular experience that I'm writing to you about happened when we first moved house around 15 years ago. All we knew about the previous occupant, which was from the next door neighbours, was that he was an old man in his 90s living in the house alone. His wife had passed away years before, and he only used one room downstairs to live and sleep in. Eventually, his family had decided that he was struggling to look after himself, so it was time to put him in a home for the elderly. Apparently, he didn't want to leave the house and refused to go, but in the end they managed to persuade him to move into the home. The neighbours told us that he was very upset about this, and said it was a shame because they had known him all that mentioned again. A year or so went by, and I always felt a little uneasy when I was in the house on my own. I used to hear funny noises, and once the loft hatch slammed down onto my head, and I told my husband, and he just told me not to be so daft, so I tried to ignore it. Anyway, one night we went to bed as usual, and I had a really vivid dream. I was in the kitchen, and I looked out of the conservatory window, and there, in the garden, was a figure of an old man. I was puzzled, and went out to see what he was doing there. "Hello," I said, "can I help you?" "Who are you?" he said. "I'm the owner of the house," I replied. "I don't think so," he snapped at me. "I've lived here for more than 50 years. This is my house. What are you doing here?" Then I realised who it must be. I don't know how he managed to get himself there, but I thought it was the old man that used to live here, and I thought perhaps he had caught a taxi or something. Maybe he had dementia or something, so I told him I'd fetch the neighbour, because they knew him very well. I headed back to the house, and when I was in the conservatory, I looked back towards him, but he was gone. I searched the garden, but he was nowhere to be seen. Anyway, in the morning, I told my husband about the strange dream and thought no more of it. A couple of days passed, and I bumped into my neighbour out at the front of the house as I was getting ready to go out. I asked her how she was, and she said she was okay, but she had had some very bad news about the man that used to live in our house. She told me that he had died a couple of days ago, and she had promised to attend the funeral, but wasn't looking forward to it, as she hated funerals. As you can imagine, I was quite shocked to hear that, but I didn't tell her in case it upset her. I told my husband about it, and he said it was really weird. I don't really know how to explain what happened to me. I feel that Jane had the dream as some kind of spirit communication from the elderly man. It is known that spirit beings can contact people via their subconscious to get the person to take notice and get messages across. The next story contains some curious photography. Jane writes, I thought I would send you a couple of experiences I have had while they're still fresh in my head after speaking to you yesterday. I do find that the subject of the paranormal really interests me, although I used to be quite sceptical. But there is no doubt in my mind now, after many things that have happened to me, that there's definitely something out there. I spoke to you yesterday about the experience I had in my old house with the old man dying. After living in that house for 11 years, we decided we wanted to move to the countryside. The circumstances in which we ended up living where we were are another story, but it was to do with fate, and it definitely brought us to that particular property. The house we ended up buying was built in 1958 and was the exact opposite of what I wanted, which was an old house with loads of character. The house we actually purchased was quite ugly and run down, and desperately in need of some TLC, but the setting was beautiful with some land in a small woodland. My husband, who is a property developer, ensured me that we could inject some character into the property by using old reclaimed materials, and that is exactly what we planned to do. Our solicitor phoned us a few weeks after we had moved in and asked us if we wanted the original paper deeds for the house. He told us that most of the information is now stored on computer and that the originals weren't needed, so we went and collected them from him. We discovered that the previous owners had had the house built and lived in it for the rest of their lives, which explained why the house was so old-fashioned. The house was L-shaped and the living room was a single story, so we eventually got planning permission to change it into a double story with bedrooms above, amongst other alterations. It was a dormer bungalow style house. When it came to removing the roof, we decided to move into the dining hall, which was large enough for the settee and the TV, etc. And eventually work began on the living room as planned. Anyway, a couple of days later, whilst watching TV, it suddenly went very, very cold, icy cold in fact, like all the windows and doors had suddenly been flung open. My husband went to check the rooms to see if there were indeed windows open, but there weren't, and after about 5 minutes or so, the icy draught dissipated. We concluded that it must be the roof in the living room, which had by then been removed, so we thought no more of it. That was until the following night when, to our surprise, it happened again. We checked everywhere in the house once again to find the source of the draught, but nothing. It wasn't windy at all outside, and again it dissipated after about 5 minutes. It continued to happen night after night. Me and my husband and all 4 of our children, my daughter's boyfriend and son's girlfriend all witnessed it, and when my dad came to stay, he witnessed it too. We began to notice that it always happened about 8:30 p.m, give or take a couple of minutes. Now my husband, my dad and my 2 grown-up sons, having what I would call a scientific brain, decided that it must obviously have a scientific explanation, although we couldn't figure out what it was, and I concluded that it couldn't conceivably be anything paranormal. Anyway, this nightly icy draught continued on for weeks. We tried and tried to get to the bottom of it, but couldn't. We actually got quite used to it. I would take up my dressing gown downstairs with me and wrap it around me when I got cold. Still, it always happened at the same time every night. We actually made a bit of a joke about it and didn't take too much notice. Although we did take to sitting in the kitchen some nights until after 8:40 when we knew it would be over. It actually became the norm. That was until one night. Everyone was watching TV. I was watching a film on my iPad with my earphones on as usual, when suddenly I felt the icy draught and pulled my dressing gown around me. As I looked back at my iPad, I noticed that it was 9:30 p.m. That's strange, I thought. It normally gets cold at 8:30. I mentioned it to my husband and son, who mocked me and said, "Ooh, the ghost must have got lost somewhere that night," or something along those lines. We all laughed. That was until my husband mentioned something that we had all forgotten. The clocks had gone forward in the early hours of the morning at 1 a.m. We all just sat there trying to get our heads around the situation, but it definitely confirmed to me what I believed all along, that it must be otherworldly. There's no explanation for it. As far as I'm aware, spirits are oblivious to our daylight saving, so technically it was still 8:30. Although they admitted it was strange, my husband and sons were still in denial, although my daughter is open-minded. The cold draughts continued every night without fail, but at 9:30 instead of 8:30. We did joke about it, but a little more nervously than before. We couldn't actually wait until we moved out of that room. The living room was coming along nicely. I told my husband that I wanted a big inglenook fireplace with a nice old beam above. We had recently renovated a 300-year-old cottage, which unfortunately had been riddled with woodworm. We saved as much of the old beam as we could and replaced them back into the cottage wherever we could, but were left with a large beam, which we used for our fireplace. We wanted to use genuine old bricks and visited the local reclamation yard. I was immediately drawn to a stack of old handmade bricks that were the perfect colour and said to my husband, "Those are the perfect bricks." We spoke to the man in the yard who told us that they had come from an old Victorian part of a hospital in Birmingham. We decided to buy them, and that's what our living room fireplace is made of. We moved into the living room and mostly forgot about the draft, although occasionally I felt it. I happened to be passing through the hall at a certain time. One day I was dusting around the fireplace when on one of the bricks I spotted the handprint of a child. It was imprinted into the brick, so I decided to research about the Victorian brickmaking and found out that sadly young children were forced to work long hours helping to make bricks in those days. I also spotted fingerprints in other bricks. I decided it would be interesting to research the history of the old hospital where the bricks had come from, and found out it used to be a workhouse for the poor, which is really interesting. I showed everyone the handprint, and they thought it was really sad. Anyway, time went by and Christmas came around, and we put up all the decorations, and my daughter was taking pictures with her phone. She took a picture of the fireplace, but accidentally pressed the photo burst, which takes loads of photos very quickly. It's about 10 frames per second, and thought nothing of it and went upstairs. An hour or so passed and she came back downstairs and told me she had been looking through her photos and had seen something strange. When she showed me the photo burst of the fireplace, one of the 10 of the photos was very different to the rest. I got her to send me the photos so I could show a couple of people, but nobody seemed to be able to explain the image. We tried for ages to recreate the photo using all the different filters, but to no avail. I will forward you the photos, including a close-up of the unusual one and the handprint, so you can tell me what you think. I wondered if it's possible that, like houses, objects could hold memories of the past. I can't explain that one picture, but it's so very different to the rest. We have since totally renovated the house. The dining hall was completely gutted and redone, and I must admit I haven't felt any draft in there since it was done, so hopefully whatever was there has gone. She also goes on to say that she forgot to mention the unusual picture of the fireplace. It wasn't at the beginning or the end of the 10-picture photo burst. It was somewhere in the middle, which Jane thinks made it more unusual, as it was just the one picture. I wonder if the sky photo, that's what I've decided to call it, is some kind of thoughtography, where a person's thoughts are captured in a photo. Because this room was frequently drafty, perhaps it might have felt to the occupants as if there was no roof, hence why the sky appears so vividly. A similar topic was covered in the episode of Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, and episodes are available on YouTube if you want to watch them. In the 1960s, a Colorado-based psychiatrist and a man who believed he could take photographs with his thoughts staged a series of experiments with Polaroid instant film. Dr. Yul Esenbud and his test subject, Ted Sirius, were trying to prove that psychic projection could manifest on film. All of the photographs from the experiment are held in the Special Collections University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and have recently been digitized. Anyone can browse these photos and the results of the experiments and decide for themselves if they believe in the thoughtography theory. There's also an episode of The X-Files from October 1996 called Unruly, which also explores this phenomenon. Can emotions and thoughts be so strong that they manifest? I agree with Jane. The handprint looks to me like a child's, although why it appears on a brick, that's very interesting. If this is a brick from the old Birmingham hospital, could that somehow be connected to the child that was there? To me, it looks like a female hand, aged around 10, but why it's there, I can't explain. Once again, many thanks to Jane for contacting me and providing me and you viewers with some very thought-provoking topics.